South Park does a lot of stuff that's pretty messed up. I know, what a profound statement to make. The show has a tendency to stick to a few different methods in order to make the audience as uncomfortable as possible for the sake of Matt and Trey's own comedic pleasure. There are so many moments in this show where it feels like the joke is on the viewer, like Matt and Trey are actively giving us the middle finger because they find it hilarious. Their methods for doing so include things like leaving viewers on a cliffhanger for weeks and then releasing a Terrence and Phillips special as the next episode, gaslighting the entire fan base and calling them racist after a retcon, and of course, their most commonly used method, creating the most repulsive moments imaginable. The show has been trying to gross out their fans since the very beginning. Whether it's having a living piece of excrement as a side character, playing real-life sex change footage at the very beginning of an episode, making a song about the horrific things being done to the food of Yelp reviewers, performing at-home liposuction surgery on Butters, or Christopher Reeves consuming fetuses to gain strength. My personal hell is the episode P from season 14, where an entire water park is filled with, well, I think you can guess, and it is just the worst. The Streaming Wars specials also have a bunch of scenes very similar to that, and Jesus, they're just horrible. I could go on and on, there's plenty more examples, but you get the picture. This show is fucking gross sometimes. But despite the countless moments that made viewers nauseous, there seems to be one episode that stands out amongst fans as the grossest of them all, and subsequently one of the most hated of them all. I saw a ton of comments on my ranking video detailing how they literally cannot rewatch this episode because of how repulsive it is. And after rewatching the episode, I can totally see why. Today, we're talking about
Ginger Kids. Oh, sick! Gross!
Oh, whoops, sorry about that, that was the wrong clip. I meant the season 15 episode, The Human Sentai Pad. It's gained a bit of a reputation amongst South Park fans as containing some of the most revolting scenes from the whole show, and this made me begin to wonder, is this really the grossest episode of South Park? Don't get me wrong, it's gross, oftentimes bordering on unwatchable, but I don't know if it's significantly grosser than some of the other things they've done. Like I said, a huge portion of the fan base writes this episode off as downright unwatchable. It's one of the top answers in every Reddit thread asking what episodes people skip when they rewatch the show. One thing that I think might be part of the reason as to why people find this episode so gross, which we'll talk about more later on, is the fact that I don't think a lot of people really understood what this episode was referencing and that this wasn't just created by the twisted minds of Matt and Trey. Although, like I said, they are certainly capable of coming up with something this horrific. But that's right, just like every super polarizing episode of South Park, this one's a parody, and we'll go into depth as to how that changes the context of the episode later. And my favorite part about making this video was that the documentary 6 Days to Air, which follows the 6-day production cycle of an episode, just so happened to be made during the production of this episode. And it includes tons of interesting and funny behind the scenes moments for the writing, voice acting, and animation of this episode. So I'll be trying to include some of those behind the scenes moments as I talk about the episode. But the horrible stuff that happens in this episode is loosely based in reality. Hypothetically, it could be possible, but surely nothing even close to this could ever happen in real life, right? Well, aside from its disgusting subject matter, this episode is actually super relevant to current events, and as it turns out, we might not be too far away from the events of this episode becoming a reality, at least if Disney has anything to say about it. Speaking of Disney, I'm convinced that them and the CCP have it out for me after my last video since it got demonetized shortly after being uploaded. So for the sake of my wallet and your stomachs, I'm gonna do my best to censor anything really gross that happens in this episode. So even if you're watching this on your lunch break, you should be all good. So now, let's find out why exactly this episode is widely considered to be the most disgusting episode in the whole show, and how it accidentally predicted the future. So, with the intro out of the way, let's get into it. South Park's grossest episode just became reality. You know, if I were in this situation, I at least would want to be able to listen to some music while I was stuck there, which is why today's video is sponsored by Raycon. Raycon's everyday earbuds are designed to make your everyday just a little bit easier. The everyday earbuds have a 32-hour battery life and multi-point connectivity, so it lets you pair with multiple devices. My personal favorite feature is the noise cancellation. It's super helpful for traveling or everyday activities like going to the grocery store. Personally, I've been using Raycons for a while now, and they've quickly become my main earbuds for my day-to-day life. I use them pretty much all the time, whether I'm going for a walk or editing a video, they're kind of always in my ears. And I never have to worry about them running out of battery because they have an outrageous 32-hour battery life, and the quick charging case allows for 10 minutes of charging for 90 minutes of battery. They're designed to fit in a wide range of ears, and they're super comfortable, so I have no issue wearing them for long periods of time. I also love these cool protective case covers. Not only do they look sick, but they also support wireless charging, so you don't have to take it off to charge it. So that's why you should go get yourself a pair right now. You can do so by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment, as well as going to buyraycon.com/blooms, and doing so will get you 20 to 50% off site-wide. That's an insane deal, and that's why you should click the link in the description right now to go to buyraycon.com/blooms and get yourself a pair. And thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. So first, let's go ahead and break down what exactly happens in this episode. So we open with the boys at recess, where Cartman is flexing his brand new iPad. The first generation of iPads had been released the year prior to this episode, so it only made sense for an 8-year-old to want to show off their shiny new Apple product. But this is Cartman, so of course he takes it a bit further than your average 8-year-old.
Funny, you don't seem to have one. I thought your family was rich.
This starts to annoy some of the other students, and Craig calls Cartman out.
Tom Saltzman says you don't really have an iPad. Tom Saltzman says you just glued a piece of glass to an iPad cover and you're faking it.
Tom Saltzman's dad is an alcoholic who drinks and drives.
This leads to Cartman complaining to his mother about not having an iPad and accusing her of screwing him over. He's a little less eloquent in how he phrases it, though.
Would you mind loaning me some of your lipstick, Mom? Because I want to at least look pretty the next time you decide to fuck me.
Meanwhile, Kyle is casually kidnapped by Apple, which they have no issue doing since
You've agreed to all of this!
Kyle runs to ask his friends for help, and when he explains the situation, they're totally shocked.
They're saying it's because I agreed to the latest terms and conditions on iTunes. Who the hell reads that entire thing every time it pops up?
I do. Me too.
He then tries to ask his dad for help since he's a lawyer, but he's not that much help either. In the 6 Days to Air documentary, they had a camera in the writer's room, and before they came up with the idea for this episode, we see them go through a bunch of ideas that would later be turned into other episodes. Things like Crack Baby Basketball and You're Getting Old. I know it doesn't really have anything to do with the episode, I just thought it was pretty interesting.
Pirates of the Caribbean 48. F you.
It's Jim Carrey in whatever, you'll pay to go see it. F you.
They're playing on ABC in front of like 20 million people. The players don't get paid. 90% of them are black. And you're like, dude, you're selling their image.
Now, when we sell their likeness for video games, how do we get around paying for our slave student athletes then?
So Cartman and his mom visit Best Buy to get an iPad, but she definitely underestimated the pricing of Apple products and realizes that they can't afford it. When she suggests getting the Toshiba Handybook instead, Cartman absolutely loses it and begins to throw so many accusations against her that if I heard it out of context, I'd think he was a kid on Twitter calling out an influencer.
You might as well go buy some cigarettes too, because I like to have a smoke after I get good and fucked.
Hard cut to Cartman crying in the car, where we get a rare moment of his mother actually acting like a mother, scolding him for his bad behavior and telling him he can't get anything. She recounts the situation in a way that I found very funny.
Why did you go outside to a police officer and say, help, help, my mom is trying to fuck me?
Cartman tries to play the innocence card, claiming he didn't know what it meant and that he's sorry, but when she's not having it, Cartman immediately reverts to his anger.
Could we at least pull up here and get some dinner? Because I like to be wined and dined after I've been fucked.
Interestingly, the whole Cartman subplot wasn't actually introduced until like 2 days before the episode was supposed to go live, and I thought that was really funny because arguably that's the most iconic part of this episode, and they didn't even have a plan for it until the very end.
Like him going home and screaming at his mom saying, you f***ed me. F*** means something naughty?
Back to Kyle, he's locked in a cell with 2 others who agreed to the terms and conditions. The woman didn't read it, just like him, and the Japanese dude can't even read English, so I mean that seems a little unfair, but we then see Steve Jobs speaking at an Apple event where he unveils his new innovative design for the next big Apple product.
I give you the human centipede!
This is the point where you may be beginning to pick up on what exactly this is parodying. Now, if you get what this is parodying, the odds that you'll enjoy this episode increase a little bit. Not a significant amount, but at least a little bit. This episode parodies The Human Centipede, a sorta horror movie that came out in 2009. The basic premise is that these 2 American women and Japanese tourists are kidnapped by an evil surgeon who plans to sew them together, entrance to exit of the digestive tract, in order to make one large digestive tract because he used to be an expert at removing Siamese twins, so he developed like a fascination with making new life or something. I don't know. I watched it a long time ago, so it's disturbing and disgusting, so much so that I learned the director didn't even tell the investors what the movie was actually about, because who the hell would invest in that? Now, personally, I was surprised when I learned that a lot of people have never even heard of this movie. I remember being a kid and friends talking about watching this movie like it was some kind of shock video. It became incredibly infamous. Everyone knew about this movie, or so I thought. I noticed while reading a bunch of comments and Reddit posts of people that hate this episode, it seems like they don't know what it's parodying. Now again, I don't think this would greatly impact the viewing experience of this episode. Like I've said many times in the past, parodying something doesn't instantly make it funny. If you parody something that's incredibly gross by making something that's incredibly gross, it's still fucking gross. But in this case, I do think it makes a difference because if you're watching this having not already experienced the shock and disgust that comes with the concept of being put in the human centipede, it's kind of hard to laugh at anything. We'll talk more about this later in the video, but for now we go back to the boys reading through the terms of service, where they discover the fine print that caused all of this.
Hold up, here it is right here.
By clicking agree, you are also acknowledging that Apple may sew your mouth to the butthole of another iTunes user. I'm gonna click on decline.
Gerald says he's going to the police, and Stan responds with a line that is only more relevant today.
Dude, when the police want to know where somebody is, they ask Apple.
Steve Jobs is busy admiring his prototype, and we get our first look at the human Sentai pad. Of course, Kyle is placed in the middle, the objectively worst section, and I will say the fact that his arms and legs can't reach the ground because he's so small did make me laugh despite the unfavorable circumstances. I also think it was pretty clever to have Steve Jobs play the role of the psychotic villain, with his desire to change the world and be an innovator being what drives him to create this monstrosity. It feels very appropriate, especially considering some of the stories of the real-life Steve Jobs and how he was kind of an insane person. In his mind, the iPad could already do everything you could possibly want from it, but it wasn't enough because it couldn't walk or read.
Until now.
Steve offers Kyle the chance to get out of it by just signing this contract, and clearly Kyle has not learned his lesson.
No, you didn't read it! This says we don't ever have to let you out and then we can do whatever we want! Damn it, why won't it read?
They conclude that they should feed it, but the Japanese man nobly refuses so that his fellow Centipede members won't have to suffer. This hunger strike lasts for about 6 seconds as he's offered a bean and cheese burrito from Paco's and gives in. We then get our first taste. Actually, that's probably not the best phrasing. We see the human Sentai pad function as intended for the first time, and it's pretty damn gross. I'm not going to show it for obvious reasons, but watching the 6 Days to Air documentary did make me appreciate the details a little more, as we see their director of animation really make sure that the animators are capturing Matt and Trey's vision appropriately.
More violent on the shake. Just gotta match Kyle's head to the butt. And then I gotta do the same thing to his butt and her head.
Yeah, what should I do next?
He's still doing his thing.
Oh, well, what should I do next? Oh, man, should I eat out the fan? Or maybe I should buy some apples.
We then cut to an episode of Dr. Phil. Cartman is still throwing accusations at his mother, causing the whole crowd to turn against her. We also get this joke from a random man in the crowd.
If I was gonna fuck my son, I'd kiss him first!
I will let you decide how you feel about that. The boys and Gerald go to the Apple geniuses, the only people who could possibly help them. This scene pretty accurately portrays the struggle of dealing with customer service for anything tech related, and I appreciated it for what it was.
This guy's son was abducted by us? Should I run a stock check or just give him store credit?
This whole subplot isn't bad, but it's definitely not as good as the other two. I do like the running gag of everyone acting like Kyle is so insane for not reading the terms and conditions, though.
He actually didn't read the agreement.
He didn't read it.
We know, it's preposterous.
We then go back to Kyle, and the Japanese man is asking him for help in deciding what to eat, but considering the whole mouth being sewn to him thing, he's not exactly clear on what he wants.
Cuttlefish and asparagus? Very well, I will eat the cuttlefish.
Just then, a whole team breaks in to rescue Kyle and the others. They bring him to a hospital and prepare to perform the surgery to separate them, but of course for surgery you need consent to do it, and Kyle has still not learned his lesson.
No! Damn it! It didn't read it!
Also, random side note, I do find it really funny that they keep making Kyle sign the papers. Like, the other ones didn't read their stuff either. Why is it always Kyle that's the one being tested? It's like you would think they'd pick the guy at the front. We then get what is probably the most notorious scene from the episode, as the cuttlefish and asparagus run right through the Japanese man. Again, not gonna show this, but to make it a little easier to stomach, I will show you the clips from the documentary of Matt and Trey recording these lines and being physically incapable of holding it together because they're laughing too hard at their own jokes.
That's a cuttlefish and asparagus.
It's so funny. It's so stupid.
That's a cuttlefish and asparagus is not sitting well. Oh no! Cuttlefish. Oh, here it comes. Oh, it's going to be a rat.
You know, watching these clips of them being unable to contain their laughter over the dumbest poop jokes that they wrote really captures the spirit of the show. From day one, it's just been two dudes whose #1 priority when writing is to make each other laugh, and I think that attitude is the reason that this show has been successful for so long. Back with the boys, they're still working with the geniuses who offer a replacement friend and store credit, but when that's not enough, the council has a quickening to discuss further. Then we go straight to Steve Jobs, Best Buy, and Dr. Phil gifting Cartman the brand new cutting-edge device Apple has been working on. I think you can guess what this device is. It is everything that Cartman has ever dreamed of.
It does email and web browsing and it shits in Kyle's mouth?
In the documentary, there's a few scenes of Ann Garofino, their longtime executive producer, talking to the people over at Standards and Practices to make sure that everything they were doing is okay and allowed to be shown on TV. And these scenes are literally some of the funniest things I've ever seen. Like, I'll just show them to you. They're so great.
When they shit into each other's mouths, we're not going to see feces in the iteration that I have seen so far. Maybe, yes, maybe we see them being sewn together. Yeah. Thanks. Happy Easter to you too. The only note I have on this week's show is pussy and faggot and shit. So, do you want to bleep it, push it, have me ask standard? What do you think?
I think we should try to see if we can get pussy and lose faggot.
Okay. Let's see what I can do.
Faggott's not funny.
All right.
The geniuses are still busy performing their strange rituals to find the answer to their problems. I will say I did like this aspect of the side plot, that the geniuses are like actual geniuses that have some sort of like ethereal powers just to help customers with their Apple products. I thought that was pretty good. They finished their tour on Raw and it's revealed the answer to their problem, and the only solution is for Gerald to join Apple.
No, I don't want to join Apple. I like my PC.
Now, I didn't mention it, but early on they set up the fact that Gerald is kind of a PC master race kind of guy, so this is a tough choice for Gerald. Now, don't get me wrong, I have an iPhone, so if I had to save my son by just having an Apple account, it would be no big deal, but if I had to switch to using Mac instead of PC to save my son, well, he better get comfortable in that human Sentai pad, because the day you see me using the command button for keyboard shortcuts is the day I admit that Pip is my favorite character. But alas, Gerald is a much better man than me and goes through with the process of signing up for Apple. So Kyle is saved and the human Sentai pad is no more, which of course means that Cartman is left without anything. He tries his whole accusation routine against the big man upstairs, but God isn't quite as patient as his mother.
How about a little courtesy lick next time you decide to f*** me?
So now that we understand what exactly happened in this episode, let's talk about how it accidentally predicted the future, as well as why it's widely regarded as one of the grossest and worst episodes in South Park. Let's start with the former. So one of the main jokes in this episode is how Kyle ended up in the human Sentai pad in the first place by not reading the terms and conditions of iTunes. All of the other characters act like this is outrageous because...
Well, how do you know if you agree to something if you don't read it?
But it's super true. No one reads the terms and conditions on anything. Every time you sign up for a new service or attend an event or really anything, you agree to a long list of legal terms and conditions that you probably have never actually read a single sentence of. Realistically, the average person has probably agreed to hundreds of these in their lifetime, and they're only becoming more common. So this episode asks the question, what if there was something really f***ed up in those terms and conditions? I mean, you're essentially signing a contract that is legally binding, so in theory, a company could get you to agree to something pretty terrible. And that's exactly what happens all the time. Obviously not quite to this extent, but companies know that no one reads these things and they take advantage of that by putting a bunch of sketchy things in there.
You can't agree by accident. Even if you click on agree, another little window pops up that says, "Are you sure you agree?" And you have to click on agree again.
Back in 2005, a software company added a line that offered $1,000 to anyone who contacted them, and after 5 months and 3,000 sales, someone finally claimed the prize. So you never really know what you're signing up for, and while there have been many cases of scummy, unethical abuse of this, no company has taken it quite to the level of the human Sentai pad, at least not until last month. And who better to showcase the terrifying control massive corporations have over every aspect of our lives than everyone's favorite morally bankrupt massive corporation? Disney. That's right, baby. 2 episodes in a row where Disney does terrible things. That's a PB, baby. Let's go. So in October of 2023, a couple visited a restaurant in Disney Springs, Orlando. They picked this restaurant specifically because it was known for accommodating people with allergies, and the wife had a severe allergy to nuts and dairy. They checked with the waiter a bunch of times to make sure that there would be nothing to trigger her allergy, to which she was assured a bunch of times that it would be totally fine. Well, it wasn't totally fine, and 40 minutes later, she was being rushed to the hospital where she would die due to the elevated levels of both nut and dairy in her body. This is totally terrible, incredibly sad, and clearly the result of negligence, so not too long after, the husband filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Disney. And this is where Disney pulled out the craziest trap card of all time. Their lawyers filed a motion to have the case moved to arbitration, which basically means have the case dismissed and settle it out of court with a third-party expert. This is a common move by large corporations because because most of the time it's a lot cheaper and they're able to pick the expert and kind of stack the court in their favor essentially. And why did Disney's lawyers feel like they were entitled to this? Well, the reasoning for having this case moved to arbitration was a clause they had in the terms and conditions of the streaming service Disney+. In 2019, the husband had created a free trial account for Disney+, and in doing so, he had agreed to their terms and conditions. These terms and conditions proudly stated, any dispute between you and us, except for small claims, is subject to a class action waiver and must be resolved by individual binding arbitration. And to translate that roughly, unless it's small claims court, you can't sue us, and if you want to, everything has to be settled outside of court where we can kind of stack everything in our favor. So to recap, the husband signs up for a free trial for Disney Plus in 2019, which he canceled before he ever actually paid for, by the way. 4 years later, his wife dies on Disney property due to obvious negligence, who herself never agreed to any of these terms, by the way. The husband files a wrongful death lawsuit against Disney, and Disney says, actually, you can't sue us because we said you couldn't in that agreement that you signed 4 years ago for a streaming service that's completely unrelated to this case. Nice try though, I win, GG, go next. The family's lawyers would respond with their own statements to summarize what it would mean if this defense actually worked, saying that Disney would essentially be preventing anyone who has ever been subscribed to Disney Plus, which is 150 million people by the way, from ever being able to sue Disney for a wrongful death case. Basically, Disney could genocide every Disney Plus subscriber and they'd never have to see the courtroom because
they all agreed.
You know, funny enough, as I was doing the narration for this video, a little terms and conditions window popped up on my computer from Steam because they just updated their terms and conditions to essentially say the exact opposite of this, basically saying, if you have any problems with us, we have to settle it in court and not in arbitration, which is honestly kind of awesome. You know, South Park has predicted the future many times, but this episode was such an over-the-top parody that you would never expect any company to stoop so low. But I guess I'm just naive, because Disney being allowed to kill you with no legal consequences isn't too far off from Steve Jobs kidnapping you and putting you in a human centipede. And honestly, that might be a better fate than dying in a Disney park. But fortunately for those involved in this case, Disney ended up realizing that the people of the court do occasionally have functioning frontal lobes, and that's way too big of a risk, so they ended up deciding to withdraw this filing. They ended up releasing a statement where it was clear that they had a big change of heart. Some say their heart grew 3 sizes too big that day. The statement read, "At Disney, we strive to put humanity above all other considerations. With such unique circumstances as the ones in this case, we believe the situation warrants a sensitive approach to expedite a resolution for the family who have experienced such a painful loss." Oh my god, I'm gonna throw up. It kind of reminds me of when CoffeeZilla exposed Logan Paul for scamming his fans of millions of dollars, and at first he made a video attacking his credibility and character, but when that didn't go well, he made another video apologizing and thanking CoffeeZilla for doing this and promising to make it right. So remember kids, if you're in a bad situation, always do the thing that would absolve you of any responsibility first, no matter how morally reprehensible. If it doesn't work, you can always backpedal and apologize later. So yeah, it seems like this case will end up being settled in court, and I hope that that family absolutely runs Disney's pockets. So now let's close this out by talking about the episode a little bit. First, let's answer the question I posed at the beginning. Is this the grossest episode in South Park? Obviously, this is super subjective, but I think most people would agree that it's at least top 5. But like I talked about, I think the viewer's perception of this episode is at least slightly impacted by whether or not you know the parody. If you don't have that initial shock of being introduced to this concept for the first time, it's still gross, but it's significantly more tolerable. If not, chances are the idea alone is enough to put it at the top of your list of grossest episodes, and the following scenes only solidify its place there. Personally, my experience was that of the former, and having watched The Human Centipede before this episode, it wasn't too bad. Like I said, still top 5, but Season 13's P and The Streaming Wars Part 2 both got to me significantly worse than this episode. I also think that this episode was so over the top and outrageous that my brain kind of formed a disconnect, and I ended up just appreciating the absurdity in it. But assuming the average viewer has no knowledge of The Human Centipede and goes into this completely blind, I think it's fair to say that it probably is. Now that leads us to a follow-up question. Does that make it a bad episode? Now, for many people, yes. I mean, if you can barely even stomach it, then of course you wouldn't like it. But personally, I like this episode. There are a ton of moments from this episode that I love. The joke that literally everyone else reads the terms and conditions every time made me laugh no matter how many times they made it. Taking the idea of no one knowing what they're agreeing to in these terms and conditions and pushing it to such an absolute extreme was a hilarious way to satirize this concept, and Steve Jobs as the madman creating this monstrosity in the pursuit of innovation was so incredibly appropriate. And as gross as the human centipad scenes were, if their goal was to create a parody of the movie, I can't really imagine a better way to do it. Cartman's side plot of being a spoiled brat felt very in character, and taking the joke to the extremes with him ending up on Dr. Phil felt like a natural progression for that joke. Even the geniuses, the Japanese man, Kyle's dad, it all worked for me. And even with all the gross stuff, I think it just made for a decent episode. I mean, it's not my favorite by any means, but it was fun and I enjoyed it for what it was. Although full disclosure, I also thought The Human Centipede wasn't a bad movie. It feels very realistic in its depiction of an evil doctor that's obsessive over these bizarre ideas, which makes sense considering it was very loosely based on some of the horrific human experimentation done by the Nazis in World War II. It does exactly what it wants to do, and it's truly haunting, which is more than I can say for the vast majority of horror movies. I liked it, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it to anyone, which is true of most movies I would consider disturbing. But I've always been a fan of disturbing media. It provides a different type of horror than what's expected, and it's a feeling that very few pieces of media are able to capture. So I guess what I'm getting at is that you should probably take my opinions with a grain of salt. So now that I've backed myself into a corner with my weird tangent, let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. So what have we learned today? Well, we learned that this probably is the grossest episode of South Park, but it's still a pretty decent episode. We were reminded of just how evil massive corporations can get, which is a lesson that we've been over quite a few times on this channel. And on a more positive note, we learned that luckily you don't have to worry about any corporations turning you into a human centipede anytime soon. Although I would be sure to read the fine print next time you sign up for a streaming service, just to be safe. But most importantly, we were reminded of the greatest lesson of them all, which is that PC will always be superior to Mac. And that is how South Park's grossest episode... Oh, whoops, that's not spelled right. Let me go ahead and undo that. Wait, what? No, this can't be. No, don't do it. No, don't.
You made a promise. This was inevitable.
In order to make one large digestive tract. In order to make one large digestive
In order to make one large digestive
Jesus Christ. In order to make one large digestive tract, why can I not say this? In order to make one large digestive am I saying it right? In order to make one large digest